Hello and good afternoon. This is Lucy Roberts from the Division of Neuroscience at the National Institute on Aging. Please, thank you for joining us for this webinar on traffic health impacts on aging. We have a fantastic lineup of talks for you over the next 2 days. To kick off the workshop by introducing our illustrious division director, Eliezer Maslia. Eliezer, would you like to give us some welcoming remarks?
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Lucy and Caroline and the team of the Division of Neuroscience for organizing this fantastic and unique meeting, first in class, really. And also thank you so much to all the speakers and attendees to the meeting for joining us to what is going to be very exciting 2 days of very unique news on Alzheimer's disease and exposome. And I mean, I think that in the last few years, we really have seen a transformation on research on Alzheimer's disease with the influx of new funds for research. This year, we got an additional 226 million from Congress, of which 151 coming to NIA and 75 million to NINDS. And as Lucy alluded, we've been actually committing a lot of these funds to research on exposome. And as a matter of fact, I mean, the last 3 years, there has been a shift really on research on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias to research on exposome. I think with the COVID period that we live, which is also part of the exposome, and then all the increased interest on diversity and social determinants of Alzheimer's and related dementias, which is also part of exposome, and now pollution and other environmental factors affecting the trajectory of AD, ADRD. I think exposome is at the very front of the research that we're conducting. And of course, genetics, aging mechanisms, and mechanisms of neurodegeneration and selective vulnerability are also very important factors. And as also we gain new information on biomarkers, and now we have a new drug finally approved, accelerated approval. I think this is a very exciting time to do the research that you're doing, and we're looking forward to these 2 days. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you, Eliezer. Wonderful. So let's get started. Manuela, are you ready?
Yes, I'm here.
Wonderful. So I'd like to start the workshop with our keynote address from Manuela Lek-Cantuaria from the Maersk McKinney Møller Institute at the University of Southern Denmark. The title of her talk is Residential Exposure to Transportation Noise and the Incidence of Dementia, a Nationwide Cohort Study. So Manuela, are you, there we go. All right.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Lucy. And yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to participate on this workshop. I agree that it's a really nice initiative that you had. So yeah, as Lucy has said before, I'm going to present you the study I've done on transportation noise and dementia. So before I actually talk about the study, let's just talk briefly about noise, right? So noise is defined as any type of unwanted sound that is considered unpleasant, loud, or disruptive to the hearing. But how can noise actually be a threat or harmful for our health? Well, so there's there are many different studies that have consistently linked transportation noise to various diseases and health conditions, such as cardiovascular diseases, metabolic conditions like diabetes, and also some types of cancer, for instance. And the thing with transportation noise is that it is a very frequent exposure, as we all know. So just to give you some data here from the European Protection Agency here in Europe, it is estimated that 40% more or less of the population is exposed to traffic noise levels are higher, at least 55 decibels or higher, which is considered to be harmful so far for our health. So because of those two reasons, actually in 2014, transportation noise has been already ranked as the second worst environmental risk factor in Europe, but this is a study from 2014, so a lot of things have been discovered afterwards. But how exactly does noise affect our health? So what are the main mechanisms behind? So it all starts with being exposed to noise, right? Which will then lead to stress responses in our brain, which is consequently, which can lead to different changes in our body. For instance, the release of stress hormones like cortisol. We can also feel the blood vessels, they can contract, which consequently it may increase blood pressure, it may increase stroke volume and pulse. So those are all biological and physiological changes in the body, or at least are mechanisms to lead to those changes. Another potential mechanism is related to sleep impairment if you're exposed to noise during nighttime. So this can reduce, for instance, the different stages of our sleep, like the slow wave sleep, which is considered to be essential for restoring the body functions, and also the rapid eye movement sleep, which experts believe to be crucial for cognitive function. Okay, but so we talked about the biological and the physiological changes in the body, but talking a little bit about what can happen. This could be, for instance, an increase in oxidative stress, blood pressure, cholesterol, inflammation, and so on, which are mechanisms behind increasing cardiovascular diseases. It could also lead to some other changes, such as an increase in the insulin, in the glucose, or in hunger, or it can also decrease the glucose tolerance, which are behind, for instance, diabetes and obesity. And it can also decrease our immune system and also, again, increase oxidative stress, which may lead to cancer. Okay, but about dementia, what happens here is that if we look some of those changes, such as increased oxidative stress or systemic inflammation and endothelial dysfunction and alterations in the immune system, those are all early events, have been identified as early events in the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So this was basically one of the main biological motivations why we decided to look. Did anyone said something? No? So this is one of the main motivations why we looked at both of these diseases. But the other fact is that, as most of you may know, dementia was considered one of the greatest health challenges of the 21st century. And this is first because it's a disease with a very rapid progress since the population is getting each time older. We can see this from this projection curve over here. And also because it's a disease with huge consequences for the diseased person and also for the families. So in general, it is a disease with also with very high costs to the healthcare system and also to the society. So you may have seen this figure from the Lancet Commission report. So basically this report just combines evidence from studies that have identified potential modifiable risk factors for dementia. And the fact is that if we compare the newest report from 2020 with the one before, it's very interesting to see that air pollution was included as a risk factor for dementia. And in general, environmental exposures now are receiving a growing attention for their possible role in the development and the pathogenesis of dementia. So that's why we decided the main research question here was whether transportation noise could be a risk factor for dementia as well. And we are not the first ones to actually do that. I have here combined some studies until 2020 that I don't have time to go into details, but the main thing that we can see here is that the findings were not consistent. So there were 2 of them that did find an association with either dementia or cognitive impairment and noise, and transportation noise, but the others did not find anything. So in a recent literature review, the authors have concluded that the current evidence is of low quality. And this is because there are not so many studies that have investigated that, and they are quite diverse in terms of the study design and the outcome definition. So this was basically the objective of our study was to also investigate the association between noise from road traffic and also railway noise and incident dementia. And we have published our study in 2021. So here's a study at the BMJ. So if you want to read more about it, you're welcome to read a bit more on the paper. But I'm going to explain also how we conduct the study. So it is a cohort study that has included all Danish residents that were 6 years old or older that lived in Denmark between 2004 and 2017. So it was a nationwide cohort, including all residents in that age range. And one thing that is really nice for epidemiologists in Denmark is that in Denmark, basically everyone will have this yellow card on their pocket, which is basically their personal identification number. But this number is used across all national health and administrative registers for everybody that lives here. So this makes it easier for us to gather information on the full address history, so the exact places that each person has lived, and also which type of house. Also, we can retrieve health information data, demographics, and socioeconomic and employment status. Just another observation. So in the study, we have excluded all the residents that we did not have the complete address history to be sure that we're able to know how much noise they were exposed to. And also we excluded all persons with a dementia diagnosis before baseline. So we just consider incident dementia cases. So now I'll go a little bit more on the address level information. So one of the things by knowing the exact address of each person is that we're also able to look at the entire neighborhood where this person lives. So this means we can also gather data on green areas around the person's house, also air pollution exposure, and also different information on neighborhood socioeconomics. And by knowing the address, of course, we're then able to estimate road traffic noise and railway noise for each cohort member. And we have used here noise at the most exposed facade, so it's the noisy side of the building, and also noise at the least exposed facade, so at the quiet side of the building. So by knowing the exact addresses for each person, we were then able to calculate an average, a 10-year average for noise exposure at the most and at the least exposed facade. And we just did that for every cohort member. So a little bit more about noise. So road traffic noise was estimated in 5 points in time with the Nordic prediction method. So this used different input variables such as daily traffic, travel speed, road type, and so on. And for railway noise, we calculated for 2 points in time and only for addresses within 1 kilometer of a railway track. And we use NOR 2000 models, which take into consideration the train lengths, types, and speed, for instance. So the models also take into consideration the exact coordinate for each address, and also takes into consideration the height. So if the person lives in the 3rd floor or on the ground floor and so on. It also considers the screening effects from terrains, buildings, and noise barriers, and ground absorption and reflections from the building, from other buildings. So here I have a map here that I just think it's nice to show, because we have a map to compare the most exposed facade with the least exposed facade in Copenhagen. So we can just see here we have the noise levels, and we can just see the big difference that it does by looking at the least exposed facade. So we can see that it's much less, much lighter in colors. And the reason we actually look at the least exposed facade is because we think this is a good indication for noise during sleep time. Of course, we cannot be sure, but we just imagine that if the persons have condition, they will often choose the side of the building that is quieter to sleep. So that's why we actually do the analysis with both, with both measurements. And here I have a map for the entire Danish country, just to point out that noise was calculated for every single residential address in Denmark. So in relation to dementia and dementia subtypes information, we have accessed health registers in Denmark. So we identified at the National Patient Register and the Psychiatric Register the diagnosis for dementia and also for dementia subtypes. And we also supplemented our definition by looking at the prescriptions of the anti-dementia drugs. So we look at the prescription register. And by doing that, we then identified almost 103, a bit more, 1,000 cases of all-cause dementia. So this would be the umbrella term gathering all dementia types, all dementia diagnoses. But we also looked at dementia subtypes. So we then looked at Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, and Parkinson's disease dementia. So to assess the association, we looked at categories of 10-year mean road traffic and railway noise, looking both at the most and the least exposed facades. And we then used Cox proportional models to estimate the associations with all-cause dementia and each dementia subtype. So all the models were adjusted by age, sex, and calendar year. So this is what I refer as model 1 in the next slides. But we also built fully adjusted models, and then we took into consideration time varying information on the country of origin. This is not time varying, but the civil status, income, occupation, and education. And for the and we also took into consideration high quality green space around the houses, the building type, air pollution exposure, and neighborhood level socioeconomic information. So just for you to know, both education and air pollution exposure were included as a sensitivity analysis, and education is because we did not have data for all the cohort members. We also built natural cubic splines to evaluate the shape of the exposure response associations for the models that I have just mentioned. So now I will present you the results for all-cause dementia. So here we have the results for road traffic noise and all-cause dementia. So we have here the noise for the most and for the least exposed facade, and here the different categories that we have analyzed. And as you can see here, we also have 45 decibels and 40 decibels was the reference category for each of them. And if we just look at the risk estimates, we can see clear associations between road traffic noise and all-cause dementia. So here we have the more or less crude model, and here we have the fully adjusted model. So here, if we compare the fully adjusted model with the one adjusted to PM 2.5 and NO2, we can see that there was a slight decrease in risk estimates, but we can still see the risk estimates were still robust to this adjustment. And if we compare with the education, we basically find the same risk estimates. So here we have the same results, the same way, but now we have railway noise instead. And again, we can see the reference category. And later on, we can here we can see the results for model 1 and model 2. So again, we can see clear associations between all-cause dementia and railway noise. Again, if we look at the air pollution, the risk estimates are still robust to air pollution adjustment. And again, the same for education. So here we have the exposure response relationship. So we have here for road traffic noise and for railway noise, and we have at the most and the least exposed facade. So we can see how the hazard ratio has varied with the noise levels. And we can see, it's just to see the shape, so not the magnitude, but we can see, first we can see here that there's a linear increase in risk according to the noise levels until it reaches a point where there's a leveling off or even sometimes small declines in risk at high noise levels. This was observed for all the exposures apart from the least exposed facade for railway. We can also see, if we compare the blue curve with the pink curve, we can see higher risk estimates at the least exposed facade. And I will briefly talk about that in the conclusions. So now I will briefly show you the results for dementia subtypes. So here we have for Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, and Parkinson's disease dementia. And we can see clear associations for Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. And if we look at Parkinson's disease dementia, we can see some indications of associations for the least exposed facade, but in general, we have a low number of Parkinson's disease dementia cases. So that's why we have pretty wide confidence intervals. Here we have the results for railway noise, and we can again see, clear associations for Alzheimer's disease. But for vascular dementia, we did not see any associations. And again, for Parkinson's disease dementia, the confidence intervals are really wide because of the low number of cases. So here we also have the exposure response relationships. So we can, here we have for the road traffic noise at the most exposed facade, and here for the least exposed facade. And each of the curves is one dementia subtype. So Alzheimer, vascular dementia, and Parkinson's dementia. And we can see again the same increase until it reaches a leveling off in risk estimates. And we can also see a decrease in risk estimates for the least exposed facade, but we also see a wider confidence interval. So now to conclude, so in general, we saw in this study, our findings show clear associations between transportation noise and dementia, both for road traffic and railway noise. And if we look at the risk estimates, they are even higher for Alzheimer's disease in comparison to all the other subtypes. So for all-cause dementia and even for some of the dementia subtypes, we can see that the associations generally follow a linear relationship. but then with a leveling off for small declines at high noise exposures. And what we speculate to be the reason for that is that there might be a tendency for people that live in noisy areas to take more precaution and more preventive measures. So this could be installation of better windows or choosing the quiet side of the rooms to sleep and so on. We also saw that the associations were robust for air pollution, which I think is really relevant considering also this workshop that is about traffic-related exposures. And we can also see that it was robust to education, which is an important risk factor for dementia. Also, if we compare the estimates for the most and the least exposed facades, we could see that they were slightly higher for the least exposed facade, which suggests that the effects of noise on sleep may play a very important role in increasing the risk of dementia, which agrees with different studies on how sleep quality is important in the development of those of dementia diseases. So, of course, I also need to point out that this is one of the few studies that exist. So, of course, it's strongly recommended to have other studies in other countries, other settings and study designs. But if this is confirmed, we imagine this can have a very large impact on the estimation of the burden of disease attributed to transportation noise. And also it opens room for preventive strategies for dementia. So thank you very much. And I have here my email in case you want to ask any question afterwards.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucy.
Okay, you ready for some questions?
Yes.
Please type your questions into the chat or the Q&A. There's one question here that I'll ask you. Do you have the ability to examine different genes known to cause familial dementia and whether there's any evidence of interaction between gene type and exposure? So, for example, ApoE, I would think, would be one.
Yes. No, unfortunately, we don't have this data, at least not for this study design. We do plan to do some analysis using a pretty smaller data set where we also have data on cognitive tests, but also from my knowledge, we don't have data, unfortunately, on the genes.
And, you know, I had a similar question about other risk factors, like it would be really wonderful to know whether there's an association between traffic, or they may already know, whether there's an association between traffic noise and sleep duration. And, you know, that would be another hypothesis to pursue. That seems really interesting. Do you have any plans to look in more detail at sleep quality and
Yes,
sleep duration?
That's a great question. We actually also have in our plans for a smaller cohort, but it still includes 60,000, 60,000 names, where we do have questionnaire data, not only on sleep duration, but also different sleep measurement outcomes. And we do plan to do some mediation studies to actually evaluate that, but we couldn't do that yet.
Okay. And I was struck by the statistic that you cited about the proportion of citizens in the EU who are living at noise levels above 55 decibels. And I wondered, how does that compare to the United States, Canada, you know, other countries, and also whether the noise levels are still increasing or have they stabilized?
Yes. So yeah, I actually don't, because I'm actually not aware of data from the US, and I would imagine that in other countries the difference can be much higher. But I don't know. I would just imagine that it will probably be higher in most countries. but I cannot say in which extent, unfortunately. But so it has increased, at least from one of the very old reports to the newer one, but it can also be because the estimation of noise may have improved in different countries as well. So it's a little bit hard to say, okay, if it's really just an exposure assessment reasoning, or if it's really, I would imagine that with the urbanization, it is becoming more noisy as well.
And Jennifer, we've posted in the chat that she's going to be presenting figures on
that's
the
great,
United
Jennifer.
States. So that'll be great.
That's perfect.
I won't scoop her by asking her to answer the question now.
But it's a good introduction for her talk.
Yeah. Yeah, there are all kinds of interesting methodological issues and constraints and possibilities that are introduced by your talk, and I really enjoyed listening to it. It was hard to stay on task because, you know, I kept thinking about, oh, what if you looked at this? What if you looked at that? So I'm really looking forward to hearing the other talks.
Yes, me too.
Let's see, if there are any other questions, please post them. There is one question here from Matt Rizzo. To what extent does living in a noisy place reflect socioeconomic status, itself a risk factor for dementia? How does hearing loss in older people factor into their risk?
Sorry.
That's okay. I wanted to see if Matt wanted to actually unmute himself and you know, join the dialogue.
Sure, that was a wonderful talk and very intriguing. And like you said, Lucy, lots of questions come to mind because developing dementia and environmental risk factors in the exposome are many. So I guess teasing it all out is really important. I think Manuela did a wonderful job based on the epidemiologic data she had from the rich data set in Denmark. So I guess I'm asking, you know, poor people live in noisy places, and is their socioeconomic status itself a risk factor for dementia? And can you tease that out of the noise risk? Another is older people have sensorineural hearing loss. And is that actually in a way protective against deleterious effects of noise? And lastly, because I live in a part of the US that is linked to a lot of rural risk, even rurality itself in the northern Great Plains is a risk factor for death from Alzheimer's disease. And that's, I think, probably #1 in the US and the Dakotas and maybe parts of Nebraska. So those are not noisy places. They're quiet. You can hear crickets chirp, but dementia is rampant. So just wondering about that sort of disconnect, and I guess whether the exposome in Denmark, the rural exposome, maybe is different than the one in the US.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. Those are wonderful questions. So starting with the socioeconomic status, I totally agree that, it also here in Denmark, we also have, which I believe is the same, but it's just because it's a small country in terms of population. The people that live in the center of Copenhagen, they are also, very exposed, highly exposed to noise, but they normally are not from a low socioeconomic status, but they are from actually a pretty high, because it's pretty expensive to live in the capital. And I think it just makes a difference here in Denmark because it's a really small population. But that's why we actually try to take into consideration all the socioeconomic status factors that we can, just to really rule out any confounding on that. So this is why, so we take the individual income and the education. We also look at the occupation. And the neighborhood socioeconomic status that I couldn't talk so much about it because of time, but we take into consideration, so we just calculate for different small areas in Denmark, how much the proportion of people with low income or unemployed or solo provider. And we use 6 different variables of that sort, which it is to give a good overview of the areas where the person live and really rule that out. That was the best that we could do. But yeah, it's a great question. About the hearing loss, also it's something that we were not doing before when we conducted this study, but in my group, the most recent studies, they are also trying to look at effect modification for hearing loss people, to see if we can actually see a difference. But this started really recently. So that's why I was not able to do that in the study. I think we didn't even have the data. But yeah, it's definitely something that we should look upon. And for the third one about the rural, yeah, that will be the case. But what I would also imagine is that might be that rural populations might have maybe a less stimulation of their, so then of course there will not be the noisy part, but there will be other reasons that would actually lead to higher prevalence of Alzheimer and Alzheimer related mortality, which, yeah, I would imagine that people living in the city, they might also have some other types of jobs and so on, where they are using their cognitive functions maybe more, but that would be any speculation.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, and actually great way of generating new hypotheses for testing individuals in their environment longitudinally with the sensors they carry that can measure the noise and the light pollution and where they go and when they're at those places. So thanks again.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you as well. A lot.
Thank you for the dialogue. We have another question in the Q&A. Is there a good model for estimating poly-environmental risk? I'm thinking of something that would be parallel to polygenic risk score, but for environmental risks. Interesting question. We may want to open that one up to the other panelists as well.
Yes, because to be honest, I wouldn't know the answer. But I can see Joel has raised.
Yeah, Joel, you
something.
want to unmute? Or are we scooping your talk?
No, I mean, well, I only have 10 minutes for my talk, so there's a lot to chew on this question because it's an area of intense interest in, in environmental health research in general, is how you deal with multiple exposures, and it's a complex business because and there are new statistical methods that are being applied to deal with exposure mixtures that may have, mostly when we're interested in parallel effects of different exposures, and there's a whole area of statistical approaches that's evolved on that. And then but I think importantly, when we talk about multiple exposures, understanding the correlation structure between them, it turns out to be very important, because you can, for something like noise, we worry about spatial confounding, other things that are varying in space that are also parallel exposures. So they've, in this case, controlled for NO2 and PM2.5 and socioeconomic status, all of which are importantly correlated exposures, maybe more so in the US than in Denmark, certainly in the US. And then, but I mean, the other important point I would make about that, which isn't an issue, for example, when you're doing genomics, is that different environmental exposures have different degrees of measurement error. You do a less differently well at measuring them. So as a result, if you try to include multiple things in models, you often run into a problem where the thing you're measuring best looks like it's most important, but mostly because you've measured it better. I guess that's something to think about. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop. I see there's another hand up.
Jennifer, do you want to join?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I've also thought about these multi-environment exposure issues, and I'll talk about it a little bit in my 10 minutes. But I think we've been focusing a lot on how to model these exposures, and we need to remember that we have to focus on the data inputs as well. So I think when we think about like the sort of combined impact of traffic noise with traffic-based pollution, to me that sort of evokes the idea of some variability across space, where you have high traffic, high pollution areas, low traffic, low pollution areas, but then you need to have some folks on the off diagonals to really try to disentangle what's going on. And I work in these big national data sets, and sometimes there isn't a lot of spatial variability because of the way people and things cluster geographically. So this, I think this is the right direction to be thinking about, that this exercise is going to be very data greedy or very data hungry. And we saw, like, just in Denmark, I mean, the amount of work that must have gone into calculating these noise parameters for all of those geolocations, I'm sure was quite intense effort. But it required an enormous amount of data, which is fantastic, but it's not always easy to come by. So I don't have an answer to the question. I'm throwing another wrench into the system to remind ourselves that we have to have the data to be able to kind of match where our thinking is heading.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, having a good resolution, and again for multi-exposures, that would be the largest challenge. So I agree with both and with Joel. That's what I've seen in most of the results that I've seen on exposome projects. What usually happens is that the ones that have the high resolution, you're actually able to detect the changes in a better way. So this is a challenge to overcome. Yeah.
Okay, and Jennifer Weave says, agree with Jennifer. Inspection of multi-exposure patterns in the study can be quite humbling. In the study area can be quite humbling. Yeah, the word that came to mind for me was daunting. And this brings me to point out a couple of themes that emerged as I was reviewing the slides for the workshop. And the first of those themes that I think that, we should keep at the forefront of our mind as we're listening to the talks is methodological constraints or challenges. So for example, are there technologies or analytic obstacles that, if resolved, would move the field forward? And clearly, we've already mentioned a few of those. And then for example, oh, well, I won't scoop anybody. And then the other theme that occurred to me is the analytic challenges posed by co-occurrence of the traffic-related variables. And we've already mentioned some of those as well. So, as we grapple with those issues through the talks, I think that this would be a really wonderful medium for generating hypotheses and possibly collaborations. So please keep those things in mind. So we're running ahead of schedule, and we have about 5 minutes. So my thought, unless any of my co-hosts objects, is to
Lucy, there's
take
one
a 5 minute
in the Q&A.
The one about estimating poly-environmental risk?
No, there's one below that.
Oh, sorry. Let me see. Here, I'm sorry. In the US, has anyone used the highly scalable Volpe National Road and Aviation Noise Model? Is anybody familiar with the highly scalable Volpe National Road and Aviation Noise Model?
Yeah, this is a nice resource that the Bureau of Transportation has put out in the past year. I think it's pretty new. My group has started working
Wow.
on it, but we don't have anything that's ready for prime time. But I think it's going to be a huge help for those of us that have been wrestling with how to make these measures for our research questions.
We're doing the same also in the Chicago area.
Jeanette has her hand up. Ms. Muted.
He said the only issue with it, it seems to be very heavy on the major roads. And a lot of times when people are looking for the effects of road traffic noise, the highway noise is not as big as like residential noise in neighborhoods. And so that might be one drawback or limitations to this data set.
Thank you. Okay, so if there are no more questions, we will take a very short break for about 3 minutes just to keep on time, and we will start back
Great.
at 1:50. Wonderful. I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Hoping that everybody's here. Yes. Okay. Thank you for the introduction. I am Amir Musavi and affiliated with University of Southern California. I do have research background in environmental exposure, air pollution characterization, and traffic-related health impacts. Today, I will be the moderator for the first session, which entitles Air Pollution Health Impacts on Aging. Today, we have 3 speakers, Joel Kaufman from University of Washington, Joanne Casey, also from University of Washington, but also we'll finish up with Jennifer Alshire from University of Southern California. Joel, are you ready for the talk? Okay, cool. So I'll set the stage for you and please give it on.
Okay, I'm assuming you can see my slide now.
Yes, correct.
Very good. Okay, so yes, with 10 minutes, I'm going to go fairly rapidly through some material today. And, you know, I said I would talk about some unanswered questions, and I'll just cut to the chase, I guess, on my unanswered questions, which are, which I think, are all large questions, and we'll be hearing more about all of them over the course of this course to the next 2 days. But one issue is, what part of the near road environment is important? And, and obviously most of my work has been on air pollution, but we've already heard about noise. But what part even of the traffic related air pollution mix is the important one, I think is, an open question at this point. Do these exposures play a role in explaining disparities in ADRD risk? And we'll be hearing more about that, I think, in some of the talks to come. But I think there's a lot of interest in the interplay between traffic-related air pollution in particular and risk as it relates to environmental justice and differences in vulnerable populations. What are the mechanisms by which these environmental exposures might increase ADRD risk? And then I think the corollary questions, which we could spend a lot of time on, are how do we answer the questions and how do traffic-related exposures fit into the larger picture of the environment, which is sometimes called the exposome. And I know the exposome is of increasing interest, but it's something we should probably all be try to get on the same page about what it is. For some work that we've been doing, we've been trying to organize a framework around how we ask those questions about how might traffic-related air pollution contribute to ADRD. This figure sort of illustrates an organizing framework for that as we move from the left through exposures, through molecular and cellular effects in the target tissues, through to pathophysiological response, to early detectable but subclinical effects, and finally to the disease states of interest. And and there are bits and pieces of all of these, but little that sort of helps us understand what regulatory agencies like the EPA like to call the mode of action. That is, how do you actually get from point A to point Z in this case, or the dementia outcomes. And then it also shows you how this figure is meant to illustrate to some extent things like to what extent are health disparities exerting influence, both with regard to variation in their exposures as a result of that, but also health disparities exerting at the end of this with regard to resilience factors as well. And I think both are important and need to be interrogated as research moves forward in this topic. When we talk about studying the environment in this, there's a, I think that most of us would like to have a broad framing of this. And if we start with the premise that many of you have heard, that the genetics loads the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. When we talk about the environment in that, we're talking about an enormous number of things that occur, and not just the things that we measure as being environmental factors, but also diet, things that are often called lifestyle factors, and a variety of things. So when we talk about the exposome, it also has to incorporate this construct as well, which is not just those things that we measure with mass spec or with a sampling device of some sort, but those things which are forming the whole sort of non-genetic milieu in which disease risk is increased. In AD studies in particular involving the environment, I would say that the incorporation of environmental risk factors always faces this fundamental challenge of getting the exposure measurement right. And I guess I would argue that in a lot of the research that we've had so far, getting the exposure measurement right has not been something that we've been up to the task on all the time. The other part of this that I want to make a quick point about is the role of environmental factors and that are continue to be modifiable, and the emphasis that often gets placed on environmental factors like individual lifestyle choices, which are only modifiable at the individual level, at a level at which we know that it's very hard to modify because those are behavioral changes, and they don't deal with issues like structural inequalities and so forth, for which require modification at either the community or the social and national level. And the environmental factors that we like to study, and most of the people in this meeting study, are things that are modifiable through public health and public policy choices that are made, and therefore may result and can result in more equitable improvements in risk over time. The last piece I want to talk about is the issue of challenge in characterizing exposure, which is getting exposure right is actually pretty difficult. And it means you have to think about what both the right time of exposure is and also the right actual assessment, measurement of exposure, the correct spatial distribution, what are the individual sources of exposure variation. And I have to say that when people talk about the exposome, there's often an unreasonable fondness for biomarkers of exposure and for new measurement technologies. And my feeling is that it's better to focus on understanding the sources of variation and the correlation structure with other risk factors, because we're more likely to be able to figure out what makes a difference in things. Two studies that we've recently published out of groups here at the University of Washington, where we've made very significant efforts at both trying to get outcome right and exposure right. One relates to a project we recently published out of the Ginkgo evaluation of memory study, a clinical trial repurposed as an observational study in which clinical diagnosis of dementia was verified through repeated cognitive function testing, as well as imaging and clinician diagnosis. And we added a intensive exposure characterization part, including going back 20 years in residential history and figuring out where people lived and linking that to exposures over time, and finding that getting the exposure right turns out to be important, and that exposures as long as 20 years before, with PM2.5 and NO2 exposures 20 years before occurrence of dementia turn out to be apparently more important than the recent exposures. So it fits with what we know is about the pathology of AD and ADRD and vascular dementia. The other study, building on the Seattle-based adult changes in thought study, is a project which, again, has extremely high quality dementia information based on following a large group of older adults over time, and then specifically for dementia occurrence. And then our groups here at the University of Washington added an even more novel and exposure assessment methods that I want to describe that allow us to characterize in fine space and time PM2.5 as shown on this figure, and the relationship we saw with 10-year PM2.5 exposure and risk of dementia was again strong and important, even when adjusted for things like neighborhood socioeconomic status, educational attainment, and so forth. So I'm going to switch, try to finish with a few minutes talking about this exposure assessment methods and some of the new advances that are going to help us, I think, really make strides in understanding exposures. And some of this is going to link with things you're going to hear about from other speakers. In particular, the spatiotemporal modeling efforts that have arisen more recently, and some of the new sampling techniques that are available, and that reducing exposure measurement error turns out to be incredibly important for robust inference in the epidemiological work. And that there's been a set of advances made over the last 15 years in statistical approaches, some of which we worked on when we were working with the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, ran specialized pollutant monitoring campaigns, more recently, remote sensing, mobile monitoring campaigns, and taken together, these can produce finely resolved air pollution estimates right down to the level of the home. These point level predictions can now be made accurately for things like PM2.5, NO2, NOx, ozone, some particulate components, and increasingly, but needing special monitoring campaigns, particle number as well. And this is important.
1 minute remaining.
There's a long history of understanding that there's extremely fine scale variation in air pollution. And, over the course, depending on the pollutant that you're looking at, the decay can be in tens of meters to hundreds of meters, but that large scale exposure characterization just gets it wrong. And this is an example from models that we've built. This is in St. Paul, a low pollution area, showing that if you just used a 1 kilometer grid, which is the figure on the right, you'd assign everybody the same exposure. But if you actually look at point-wise exposure, those dots represent buildings and homes in the region, but the exposures are very different. And this is for PM2.5, which is the least variable in space. So if we look at traffic-related air pollutants, you're going to see much more. So I just want to close by talking about mobile monitoring and the ability to really get exposure right, especially for ultrafine particles, which we're increasingly concerned is actually the pollutant of concern. Series of projects that have come out of the University of Washington over the last few years, funded by an NIA and NIEHS project, based again on the adult changes in thought cohort, but have set the stage for being able to do this, we think, really right across the country in terms of characterizing ultrafine particle exposures based on driving a instrumented vehicle around, collecting data through stops that we make off the road, through a sophisticated sampling method in the vehicle, in real-time data. And then we can develop these models that are able to very accurately pick up not just the roadway signal, but the aircraft signal and other things that are going on in the area. So ultrafine particles are highly variable in space. And since there hasn't been routine data collected from regulatory sites, the need to do these kinds of campaigns appears necessary to get ultrafine particles right. And these are sized different in different areas, and I'm running out of time. So I'm just going to say that it's hard to do, but we think we've sort of cracked this nut to some extent. Sampling design is important. So a lot of questions we believe we can answer with this information. And I'll close with my little cartoon again about mechanisms and try to wrap it up in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. That was really a good talk. I guess the overview was really perfect. Like what is the problems and what they're trying to achieve. Let me check to see if you have any Q&As. I haven't seen any. If anyone has any questions
I
at
have
this
a
point,
question.
please.
Can I, while other people are typing their questions into the Q&A or the chat, as Joel, as you were speaking, I had, I was thinking about, the difficulty in sort of balancing the value of doing retrospective longitudinal studies against the improvements in technology. And I just wondered, how do you balance that? And, how difficult is it to take those improvements in technology and apply them retrospectively? I would imagine in some cases, like the sampling cars, it's impossible, but in other cases, is it possible to apply new
Yeah,
technology retrospectively?
so it depends on how far back you want to go. I think you might actually hear from Dr. Casey about an effort to go back very far, but for example, PM 2.5 models, we're pretty confident in our models going back to about 1980. For our NO2 and NOx and ozone models back to about 1990 in space and time. But yes, the ultrafine is going to be a challenge because there is no history of doing this monitoring over time. So trying to understand ultrafine relies more on assumptions about current exposures and their relationship to exposures over time, which is a challenging assumption, and why we have to look at physiologic changes kind of in real time and try to link those back to pathological changes over a longer period of time. Is that answering your question, or have I gone off on the wrong tangent?
It does answer my question, and very impressed because that's a long time to be able to go back.
Yes. Is there any other question? I don't see a Q&A. I can ask a question actually. In terms of the new measurements that could potentially increase the accuracy, or let's say the accuracy of the measurements, what do you think of the new low-cost monitoring and the crowdsourced data that would potentially be helpful on the modeling side, but also try to reduce the errors on kind of residential exposure? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting and exciting area, low-cost sensors. I think that low cost is often in the eyes of the beholder because they're low cost to deploy, but maybe high to actually incorporate their data meaningfully into modeling because of the calibration and the measurement error and so forth. But I think you're right that for certain kinds of pollutants, sensor data is going to help add to our ability to get fine scale gradations right. I think we feel like we already are doing a pretty good job with many of the pollutants, but that we can probably do a better job with some specific things for which there aren't good spatiotemporal models yet available. We actually recently published our ability to do that with carbon monoxide on a trial basis in Baltimore, for example, where we can look at CO, which is of course probably brain toxic, that we can find extremely fine scale when we combine data from sensors placed at homes around the area, along with sort of the regulatory reference grade monitors, and sort of integrated together in a model. The low-cost sensors, I'm always very nervous about using them directly because they're not calibrated, they're not reference grade, and so forth. But I think to help understand spatial scale in some applications, particularly things like wildfire smoke now, I think we know that there aren't going to be regulatory monitors close to where the fires are. So if low-cost sensors can be deployed, or people live there and have them, that'll add us, I think, a lot to understanding the spatial scale of things like that.
Great. Yes. Thank you. I just wanted to see what's the, so we have question from Manuela, and then also I see one hand rise. So the question from Manuela is to give
Amir,
an.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but in order to stay on schedule, why don't we move to the next talk and we
Okay.
can bring these questions up during the discussion session?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. Cool. So let's let me introduce the second speaker, Joanne Casey from University of Washington. She's going to talk about some neighborhood level stressors. Joanne, are you ready for the presentation?
Joan's, yeah, there we go. Joan had a conflict that came up, so she will join us for the discussion session, but she kindly recorded her talk so that we could keep her in the agenda in her place. So there we go.
Cool.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joan Casey. I'm an assistant professor of environmental and occupational health sciences at the University of Washington School of Public Health. While I'm bummed to not be there today, I'm excited to talk a little bit about how we might measure traffic-related air pollution to study health, providing some hyperlocal and historic perspectives. I know you just heard from Joel Kaufman on some of the open questions linking TRAP and health, and I wanted to start by pointing out another dimension I'm not sure if Joel mentioned or not, but that's that we see significant racial ethnic disparities in ADRD incidence. It's estimated that ADRD incidence is 40 to 100% higher in Black versus non-Hispanic white Americans. And this may be partially explained by differences in environmental exposures. We know that disparities exist in nitrogen dioxide exposure in the United States. This is a traffic-related air pollutant. Here, taking a look at the maps, let's hone in on non-Hispanic Black versus state average. So this is showing the average exposure of a non-Hispanic Black resident by state and how it compares to the state average. So purple here is bad, meaning that non-Hispanic Black individuals in virtually every state in the United States, except perhaps South Carolina, it looks like, have higher levels of exposure. And in some places, like many northeastern states, over 35% higher levels of average exposure to nitrogen dioxide. We also know that disparities exist in noise pollution. This is some work that I participated in looking at block group level nighttime noise levels across the continental United States. And what we saw here was that as the proportion of non-Hispanic Black residents increased at the block group level, we saw on average higher nighttime noise levels. Now I want to turn to how we actually measure exposure and why that matters. So we might want to try to think in a hyper-local fashion, be as spatially accurate as we can. Knowing what the level of traffic-related air pollution is at a county level may not be specific enough for us to be able to detect relationships with health. There can be a lot of variability within a county in terms of level of air pollution exposure. We also might want to think historically. A lot of modern day studies have looked at exposure to air pollution in the past 10 years or so, as it's related to Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. But what about early life exposure? And what might that mean for late life cognitive decline? So traffic-related air pollution exposures for EPI studies are usually estimated based on distance from a nearest road, from the level measured at a central monitor, like these EPA monitors I'm showing you here in the Bay Area, or modeled or based on satellite imagery. Monitoring in a different way via Google Street View cars can identify areas of pollution not predicted by models, not picked up by satellites, or that vary non-linearly with distance to road. It can be difficult to conduct this kind of mobile monitoring over long periods of time, but partnering with a fleet like Google can be really helpful. And this can help fill in the gaps, identify hotspots in communities we wouldn't otherwise measure. So for example, here in Oakland, there's only a single air quality monitor. There it is in West Oakland. So if we were to assign exposure to people in West Oakland based on this levels at this monitor, we might have to assign everyone the same level. That doesn't really make sense. So using Google Street View cars, Josh Apte and others conducted measurements between 2015 and 2016 there were 24,000 total vehicle kilometers traveled on 750 kilometers of roads in Oakland over this time period. These cars were driving 6 to 8 hours a day and had monitors strapped onto the cars that would measure on the minute-by-minute basis. These are some of the driving patterns. And what you can see here is this local hotspot around that X. This is a metal scrapper. And these levels wouldn't be picked up using other methods than the method of driving by and collecting data. So in the end, the group measured 3 types of traffic-related air pollution: black carbon, nitrogen dioxide that we talked about earlier, and ultrafine particles. They found that levels of these particles could vary 5 to 8 times along the face of a single city block. So a lot of hyperlocal variability that we would completely miss using some more conventional exposure assessment methods. And I wanted to mention ultrafine in particular. These are particles less than 0.1 micrometers in diameter. They don't actually correlate that well with levels of PM2.5, so we can't just use PM2.5 as a proxy. They come from things like diesel engines or brakes on cars. And they may be really critical for brain health because these ultrafine particles can cross the blood-brain barrier. We can inhale them directly into the brain through the nose. And we know that they can enter the bloodstream from the alveoli and then potentially enter the brain that way as well. Ultrafine is not regulated by the US EPA and thus is not routinely monitored really anywhere in the United States. So we don't have great data on it. So here we would really need something like Google Street View cars to collect this data. I just wanted to provide a quick example. This isn't in older adults, but of ways that using this type of hyperlocal data can help you uncover disparities in exposure that may explain disparities in outcomes. So here we looked at preeclampsia among pregnant people living in West Oakland, and you can see there's quite a discrepancy in preeclampsia, with non-Hispanic whites having a 6.6% prevalence and non-Hispanic Black individuals having a 10.6% prevalence. And so when we conducted a hypothetical intervention, reducing traffic-related air pollutant levels to their 25th percentile, we did in fact observe reductions in risk of preeclampsia, pretty much localized just to non-Hispanic Black birthing people. And you can see here that's true for both NO2 and black carbon. So this type of method could be applied similarly to looking at the health of older adults living in a relatively small geographic area, but where there actually may be quite a bit of variability in exposure. Wanted to finish talking about historic exposure measurements. And this is a project I'm working on with Lucas Henneman at George Mason and Elizabeth Rose Mayetta at UCLA. And here we're trying to link early life traffic-related air pollutant exposure to HRS participants in 1940. So we're going way back in time. A key limitation here is there was no air quality monitors available in 1940, and so we have no data with which to compare our models to. So what are we doing? We're actually using historic data on street networks across the United States and a metric that Dr. Henneman developed called roadiness. So we're getting street network data. This is mostly compiled by John Logan at Brown. We're overlaying grids and summing road lengths within each cell or enumeration district. And then we're calculating roadiness based on inverse distance weighting. And so what we can do is actually look at how roadiness performs in modern day where we do have air quality measures. And what we can see here, these are kind of 3 tertiles of roadiness that they correlate quite well with observed NO2 reductions from 1980 to almost 2020. And so we're pretty happy with how this metric seems to perform modern day. And now we'll go back and calculate it in 1940 and be able to link this to HRS participants. And so we have some preliminary data. This is calculated at the enumeration district level. I'm just showing you here Baltimore and Tulsa, but we're doing this for a large number of cities across the United States. And so we'll have this gradation of exposure to roads, which can serve as a proxy for traffic-related air pollution early in life. And then we'll be able to look at late life, cognitive decline, and dementia diagnoses. I wanted to finish mentioning some environmental justice considerations of this work. So we know that those exposed to higher levels of air and noise pollution are often also socially disadvantaged, facing what Dr. Rachel Morello-Frosch has referred to as a double jeopardy. In our work, we're planning to look at joint environmental and social stressors in 1940, how factors such as traffic exposure and measures of structural racism, such as redlining depicted on the left-hand map here, may correlate with each other and amplify the effects of each other on health. So it's this joint environmental exposure that individuals may have faced that in particular could lead to adverse cognitive health outcomes in late life. So I will stop there. I know we're trying to keep on a very tight schedule, but big thank you to collaborators across the United States and also to our funders, NIEHS and NIA, on these projects. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It was a very good talk, I guess, because we are trying to make sure that we are on time for all the presentations. I would, if there is any like emerging questions, we can answer very quickly, but if not, we can just transfer all of the questions to the end of the session so that we can have a fruitful discussion. If that's good for everybody, I can introduce the final presenter of this session. Jennifer Alshire is going to talk about cognitive health and some associations between neighborhood level stressors, PM 2.5. Are you ready, Jennifer?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Okay, let me start my own timer here. Okay, so I think that my talk, fortunately, I don't have to cover some things because the prior presenters, as I had hoped, have covered quite a bit of relevant content. And so in my talk, I'm really going to focus on kind of the development of my thinking around the idea of multiple exposures. But in my case, I think a lot about physical environmental hazards and how they interact with social environmental stressors. So I got into this research largely thanks to my colleague, Tuck Finch at USC, who put together a really excellent multidisciplinary group on pollution and the aging brain, but really it was pollution in the brain across the life course, but I was the gerontologist in the group. And in working with this this topic, I also kind of veered into a side topic on the brain as one of the target organs for stress, and thinking about how pollution is concentrated primarily in high poverty or otherwise disadvantaged communities, and these are the same places where we tend to find other kinds of stressors. So I started off with a question basically about how neighborhood stressors may exacerbate the adverse impacts of air pollution on cognitive health in older adults. There had actually been quite a bit of work up to that point in children on the interaction between air pollutants and stressors, although it wasn't necessarily neighborhood stressors. But that was kind of what led me in this direction. And this is a, I would say, highly simplified conceptualization of this. This is not a causal diagram by any means, but really we think about environmental hazards like air pollution and how they have impacts on respiratory health or cardiovascular functioning or cognitive health. And I'm just really interested in understanding how the concurrent exposure to social environmental stressors, things like poverty or violence, I'm going to speak mostly about disorder, but also thinking about something like noise, which is relevant for today's topic, could actually have some kind of a moderating effect on that. And in this case, we're thinking about this operating through a psychological stress mechanism, although there are other mechanisms. And that really, that these things are combining to increase biological susceptibility that would make the impacts of exposure to air pollution more severe. So I did a paper, I'm going to go past this really quickly, but we try to use the data that we have, and I had a data set, but it was a study that started in the 1980s, so really had very low representation of Latinos. And I picked the data up when we started having EPA-based monitoring of fine particulate matter air pollution. So in 2001, 2002, the sample was old enough that I could look at cognitive functioning, but it had very few non-white participants. It also used a bit of an older version of measuring cognitive functioning, the short portable mental status questionnaire. But I did find that if we separated the sample out into people who lived in low stress neighborhoods and high stress neighborhoods as defined by things like signs of social disorder, that really the relationship that we were finding between air pollution at the neighborhood level and older adult cognitive functioning was most pronounced among people who lived in high stress neighborhoods. And actually there really wasn't a strong relationship in people who lived in lower stress neighborhoods. But those data had some issues, and so we've started looking at this now in the Nationally Representative Health and Retirement Study. It's a more diverse sample. It is also longitudinal, and it has a better assessment of cognitive functioning, but also incident cognitive impairment and dementia. So that's the direction we're going in. So this is that relationship that I spoke about before, and the vertical axis is the predictive cognitive functioning score by the level of PM 2.5 in the census tract in which an older adult in the sample lives. And there's a negative, there's a correlation here where with the increasing concentrations of PM 2.5, we see a lower cognitive functioning score of about 1 point, which is like fairly significant on this particular assessment in terms of the substantive meaning of a 1 point difference. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the details about how we measure pollution here. This is not the kind of fine scale, high resolution measures that Joel was talking about, but it's kind of like what we're working with at the moment. And then there are other people that are working with the HRS to create more fine scale PM 2.5 resolution estimates and also other estimates of other air pollutants. But so just to back up a minute and explain what we mean when we're talking about neighborhood disorder, this is a concept that really comes out of urban sociology, primarily sociologists who are working in the city of Chicago. But it's the idea that it's a space, a neighborhood, an environment that shows signs that might make people feel that they don't have a lot of safety in their neighborhoods, signs of neglect or decay, sort of a sense of rundown buildings in the neighborhood. And research has shown this to be potentially a significant source of psychological distress for the residents. And there's also been research specifically in older adults showing negative impacts on both physical and mental health. In the health and retirement study, we have both reports from the respondents themselves about how much they think their neighborhood is showing these signs of disorder, but we also have reports from the interviewers who observed the neighborhood while they were there for an in-person interview. So we just did the same exercise as with the prior kind of older data set that had some limitations to it, but we actually found the exact same pattern, which was that relationship between higher levels of PM 2.5 concentration and lower scores on the cognitive assessment were really only found among individuals who lived in neighborhoods with higher disorder. In this case, because we had both predicted and observed, we were able to look at both of those measures. And we found the stronger signal in using the measures of observed disorder that came from the interviewers. But so I should say, so as I was working on this, we were thinking about other kinds of neighborhood characteristics and traffic and noise and other things like that were obviously sort of in the back of our minds. And so we really wanted to start looking at some of these other potential neighborhood stressors. Traffic is a little difficult for me to totally wrap my head around because it's sort of a source of pollution, but also noise is a psychological stressor. So it doesn't fit neatly into these boxes that I showed you before with physical environmental hazards and neighborhood stressors. So we're working with that national transportation data source of data that we mentioned just a while ago. During our discussion. And so we're trying to get those linked to the respondents, but they have kind of other issues that I find not totally satisfying, which is that the potential hazards of traffic may be beyond just noise and air pollution, but that living in a high traffic neighborhood might also discourage older adults from getting out and walking. And we know that physical activity is another risk factor for cognitive decline and onset of dementia. So we did start looking at this in the data though, because the interviewers starting a few waves back were also asked to comment on the amount of traffic in the neighborhood. So as I said, the health and retirement study is nationally representative. it's, I think, really important to understand what that distribution might look like in the population. And it sounds like Jennifer Weave's going to give us some more detailed information about that than I can give today. But at least I can say from an interviewer's point of view, how many people in this large sample of older adults actually live in high traffic neighborhoods. And actually fewer than 5% of the respondents live in what an interviewer would consider to be a heavy traffic neighborhood. Another 14% live in a neighborhood that would be characterized as having moderate traffic. A quarter of the sample live in a place that an interviewer characterizes as having no traffic. And then, just over half have light traffic. So there might be a timing issue here about when interviewers are in the neighborhood, but they do spend a pretty significant amount of time there, several hours, both inside and outside the house. So their assessment is probably pretty fair. This is not asking about noise, and of course there are non-traffic based sources of noise. So this is really just asking about how much traffic is in the neighborhood. But we decided to go ahead and use this in some initial analyses as well to try to understand if we see any kind of a relationship between traffic volume in the neighborhood where these older adults live and their cognitive functioning. So this is the predicted cognitive functioning score from additional models. These models are kind of minimally adjusted just for age, sex, and race ethnicity. But we do actually find a relationship between older adults who live in a moderate and heavy neighborhood having lower scores on that cognitive functioning battery than those who live in neighborhoods that have no traffic volume, basically. Oh, and I think I just skipped one point I wanted to make, that when we're talking about samples of older adults in the United States, at least, we do have a high number of people who live in rural areas compared to maybe other similarly high income countries. But also we have a lot of these suburban areas, and because of the patterns of city changing over time and the mobility patterns of people over the life course, a lot of older adults do actually live in suburban environments, which may not have a lot of traffic activity. So that's something we have to think about in a nationally representative or a national sample. It wouldn't come up as much in the single city studies. But returning to this point, so we did find a correlation between traffic volume and cognitive functioning. And of course, our question was, is this really just picking up on pollution, or is there something else about the traffic? So we did also adjust for PM 2.5 in the model. Those are the estimates that you can see on the right. And as you can see, there's not much difference between the two models. So just as you heard from the earlier presenter and the data in Denmark, that we also didn't find any difference in the association between traffic volume and cognitive functioning once we adjusted for PM 2.5. However, when we adjusted for individual socioeconomic characteristics, that actually did basically account for the association that we're seeing between traffic volume and cognitive functioning. So I think we need to think about whether or not traffic is correlated with other kinds of neighborhood stressors. And this begs the question of what we're actually measuring when we're talking about traffic and its impacts on the aging brain. So this line of research, I think, is just more evidence that there are probably very important synergies between physical environmental hazards, neighborhood social stressors, and their impacts on aging and brain health in older adults that we should be paying more attention to, with obvious limitations of our current state of the field in terms of modeling and data. I'm looking mostly at physical disorder and social disorder, but there are other types of neighborhood stressors that I think we would want to consider as well, noise obviously being one of them. So I like that the EPA a few years back started talking about this in terms of a total environment framework that really is asking us to focus on the sort of multi-layering of physical, built, social, and economic environments that individuals live in. And our challenge, I think, is going to be thinking about how to model and get the data to really understand what are the independent and interactive effects of these different environmental conditions on aging processes. And as I noted quickly before, I think of traffic as just like a very unique aspect of this whole thing, because it is both a physical and a social stressor. So it's related to air and noise pollution, but there might be other kinds of forms of stress that are being generated from traffic that don't operate just through those pathways. And there might be other kinds of adverse impacts that are important for health of older adults. As I said before, for instance, creating what might be perceived to be unsafe environments that reduce walking behaviors, for instance, or other forms of physical activity. And that's it for me.
Okay, thank you. I guess this was a really good presentation and it covered a lot of materials in terms of the stressors and kind of the disproportionate exposures. We have 15 minutes till our stop before we go on to the break. We have a couple questions. I'll start with the question to Joel that we didn't have the time to address at the point. It's a question from Manuela. She's asking, was traffic noise considered in any of the models in the 2 studies you cited before? Were the models also adjusted to traffic noise, basically? If so, what was found?
Well, I think the short answer is no. Neither of these studies, and most of the studies on air pollution have not had good noise data to work with, and that's sort of maybe coming online now as we're hearing about from some of the presentations and so forth. And this has actually been a problem in the United States, is that there's been, compared to Europe, is that we don't have sort of national noise models the way there's actually an expectation in Europe until recently. And we don't even collect the kind of traffic volume and congestion data routinely in the US that you would need for inputs into that at a national level that's only usually collected at the local level. So it's going to be a challenge to get that piece right, I think, which I think it's great to hear there's some new work going on in that area.
Yeah, great. I guess there was a question to Jennifer, and the question is, in the health and environment study, was there any dealing with other issues that may be spatially correlated with air pollution, such as urbanicity, a lack of green space, or multi-generational poverty?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And that's really what my group's kind of wrestling with at the moment. So this idea of this kind of multi-layered environment is, I think, something a lot of us are trying to tackle. And it's difficult because the pollution data come from, model-based estimates using ground monitoring and satellite data. But and green space comes from these rasterized files with land use, but then some of the other characteristics like poverty or disorder are coming from other administrative data sets, or they're coming from respondents' own perceptions of what's happening in their environment or our interviewer observations. And so we're trying to figure out how to model all of those things. But one of the things that we do first is I always try to understand what the distribution of the sample is across all of the different environments, because I don't want to be making a lot of out of sample predictions or, running models that can smooth over places where we have no data, because it's like fictional forecasting, basically. So we try to do our due diligence first to understand the data. It turns out, as we've noted, that takes a lot of work, and so it's making all of these projects, the timeframes sort of stretching out seemingly forever. But we are hoping that in the end we end up with better predictions of what's happening in people's spaces.
Yeah, exactly. There's also another follow-up question about have you looked up the fleet character? Like, have you looked up the truck versus bus, or like trucks and SUVs?
So that national noise data that was mentioned before in the chat does distinguish between road traffic, airport and plane noise, which I think is important, and also waterway noise. I don't know that we have a lot of, we have a little bit more specificity beyond that, and that data, I don't want to misstate things. And what I just showed, it was just an assessment of whether the neighborhood was considered a high traffic or a low traffic neighborhood, basically. So there's not a lot of resolution on what kind of traffic the neighborhood has primarily, or what was observed by the interviewer. But I think that these are, again, some of the challenges that we have as researchers in trying to think about what are we even talking about when we're talking about traffic, and then how do we go out there and get the data that we need to actually measure these concepts well.
Great. There was a question that I asked to Joel that he answered in text. but it was about basically the indoor versus outdoor model precision. RV incorporated the most of the times that are being spent indoors. I guess
Yeah.
your response was there, but of course it's a good discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it relates to the whole, points that I think we've been circling around in all of the presentations, which is about, what are we measuring and are we able to get the measurement right? And so what we'd really like to know is what's, arriving at the person's breathing zone and what's arriving at the person's eardrum, right? In terms of all of this and what the stressors are when they're walking around on the street and the ability, the ability to get those things right. So the question is that particularly older adults, maybe the people we're most concerned about at a National Institute of Aging meeting, we know they spend almost all their time indoors at this point in time. So what does that mean in terms of all of these exposures? I think it's a really important question. And we know for air pollutants a lot about this actually, which is that it varies depending on the pollutant. So the little particles, the fine particles, they infiltrate quite efficiently from the outdoor into the indoor. And so those combustion-derived particles and resuspended road, the smallest part of road, other non-tailpipe emissions, do go from outside to inside in the homes unless somebody has high efficiency filtration or air conditioning on. So we know that. But then there's other pollutants that don't. And it really varies depending on the individual pollutant, and things like ozone that are highly reactive mostly don't get from the outside inside. So what we measure outside does not very well reflect the indoor environment. However, I don't want to totally write that off, the importance of something like outdoor ozone, because ozone reacts with other things, and it's those oxidation products, which both can go indoors and may be responsible for health effects. So it's a complicated story, but it's a bigger part of the story of trying to get the exposures right in order to make inferences, I think, here.
Correct. I guess I can quickly add that in the indoors area, the infiltration rate is always especially in the places that the high traffic exposure is there. The houses are really old, so the infiltration rate is really high, but also the indoor sources such as the cooking and especially the VOCs these days after the sanitization has been a huge spike in the indoors. So it would be really interesting to also look at that and see how that is contributing to the indoor exposure too.
I just wanted to add one
please,
additional wrinkle to this that I've been thinking about. So I work with colleagues and they're trying to measure noise, and we're thinking about traffic-based noise, but there's also just human-based noise. And so there might be environments where there's not necessarily a lot of traffic, but there's a lot of business that spills out onto the street. There are a lot of people out on the street, and maybe like at night times when the bars close, or I don't know, something, that there's lots of noise. And so if you're thinking about like a sleep disruption pathway, I think we have to think about the temporality of, there may not be a lot of traffic noise at night because not a lot of people are necessarily driving, but there might be other kinds of noise. And it's not clear to me that the data we have right now will help us with that, will really pick up on that. Although this idea of kind of installing monitors where people are, I think would help with that a lot. And we've done that in sleep research by monitoring light in people's rooms and noise in people's rooms as they sleep. And I think that there's some things that we can glean from kind of other areas of research to think about how, if we think the pathway is really noise, then how do we really need to collect those data to understand how much of it is noise versus how much of it is pollution. I guess, I don't know, in preparing for this workshop, what I've decided is traffic is even more complicated than the things we are already trying to wrap our minds around.
Exactly. I guess there's another challenge. I guess this is a discussion that's open for everybody, that when we are talking about noise and traffic air pollution at the same time, spikes sometimes happens at the same time, and the lows are also at the same time. So it's really hard to also distinguish when there's a combined effect. So I guess as we get closer to the address level pollution, the noise will also have its own granularity in terms of the temporal and spatial. There is another Q&A question I'm not sure who is it referring to, but maybe panelists could answer that. We have 5 minutes. Have you tried using NPO TSA data that should be consistent within metro regions, and it's very granular and corresponds with census data? I agree that filtration quality is a help with, but also a research issue. Any ideas on the question? Nope. Okay. We have the last 5 minutes, and if you think, yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead,
can I
Lucy.
interrupt?
Of course.
Would Wig like to tell us more about MPO TAS data? We could. Caroline, can you allow him or her to speak?
Yes, I've asked them to mute.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Yeah, this is Wig Zamor from the Boston region, Somerville specifically. We've done a lot of research with Tufts and the other research universities here. The metropolitan planning organizations in the US, which almost every city has, and they're regional, they each have to create quite granular surface transportation models for air pollution. It's a legacy of the Clean Air Act of 1970, and they continue to do that. Those models TAZs are basically like census block groups, but they're a little bit more boundary drawn across, with regard to roadways and rails and things like that. But there's a correspondence table, and they're consistent within each region. And they crank out air pollution data as well as traffic. They know heavy duty vehicles versus cars. They know congestion. They know speed levels at different hours of the day. So that's one area, especially universities that are doing a lot of research within their metro areas. That might be one thing to look at.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you
And
very
it looks like
much.
there's one more comment in the chat.
Yes. There's one more comment from Doc that it says nose is not affected by wind direction and speed as much as air pollution. So near roadway, there will be a substantial separation between them, which is correct. But I'm hoping that the combined effect could be distinguished also in the other areas when wind is not helping us sometimes. Cool. I guess we have another question, which is how would traffic exposure models used for dementia-related outcomes differ from those for the other chronic disease, like CVD? Would differences in the etiology relevant exposure period be the main consideration? I guess from our panelists, whoever would think that a response would come. Maybe Joel. How about you, Jennifer?
I could take a crack at this. It's again a good question. What's the right relevant outcome? And I actually think it depends on which part of the biological process you're thinking about. So if what you're thinking about are, for dementia, if you're thinking about processes that are going on very early, the initial plaque or whatever that you're trying to understand, then those are going to be probably, you need to look at exposures a long time ago. And then if you're looking at, resilience kinds of issues or something like that, obviously you're looking in real time and what's going on. So it's, and all, and if you're thinking about vascular phenomenon that are sort of go on iteratively over time and can be prevented through, blood pressure, if that's a mediator, then that is sort of somewhere in between. It's sort of recent, but not really long ago kinds of stuff. So I don't know, I think you just have, it's very dependent on the scientific question that you think is going to be the relevant bit for traffic exposures, just like for anything else. And I think people need to pay attention to it, but it's been hard for people to Because the data availability and the exposure time side has been sort of, you use what you can find, which often leads you to a cross-sectional analysis, which might not be what you were thinking of really wanting at all.
Yeah, the best viable product, basically. Cool. I guess we are at the time right now, 11:50. Thank you for joining into the session. I guess we're gonna go. I'm gonna hand the stage to Lucy, but I'm sure that we're going for a break right now.
Great, thank you, Amir. I just wanted to give, Jennifer, did you want to add anything to that question, or did you just have your camera on because you have it on, or?
Oh yeah, no. I completely concur with Joel.
Okay.
You just
All
beat
right,
me to
great.
the camera button.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so we will take a break and we'll be back at 3:05. This has been a really fantastic session. Lots and lots of questions and lots of information that that I didn't know before. And so we'll see you back at 3:05.